Hi, and welcome to the Team Deacons podcast. This podcast is a dialogue between Roger and James Deacons, joined by Matt Wyman, starting from a submitted question and ending who knows where. We're also joined by guests on occasion. We're connecting through Zoom, so bear that in mind when you hear the audio. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so by emailing pod, at rogerdeacons.com. So today we're joined by Matt Wyman, and we also have a special guest. She is the goddess of post, a very well-known name in Hollywood, and she's been a great friend of ours for many, many years, and we've worked with her on so many films, and she has taken the journey with us from film to digital. So we want to welcome Bev Wood. Thank you, Bev, for being here. And Bev, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, it's nice to be here. In a nutshell, I entered the motion picture business in the early 80s, working for Kodak, and was lucky enough to get transferred out to the West Coast. I worked in San Francisco with small laboratories. I was an analytical chemist as far as schooling was concerned, and I was looking at process streams for efficiency for Kodak, as well as working with cinematographers, helping laboratories troubleshoot problems. When I got transferred down to Los Angeles, MGM, which used to have a laboratory called Metrocolor, was my first major account. And after 3 or 4 years, they hired me away from Kodak, and I went to work for them looking at their process streams. Again, calling on problems in the laboratory, which included meeting cinematographers as they were in the middle of shooting a movie. And then I was lucky enough to go to Deluxe, which is a much larger laboratory. And I began to do the same thing, to try to create efficiency within the laboratory as far as the process streams are concerned. Meanwhile, I loved filmmakers. I loved the whole concept of making movies. I kept up on directors, cinematographers. And one day there was a call that there were a couple of filmmakers coming in. They had a special project. The people that I worked with had no idea who it was. So I was sitting in a room waiting for this unknown group to come in. And sure enough, walked in Darius Kanji and David Fincher. The movie was Seven. They wanted to do silver retention, which I had done before at Metrocolor. And my life in the cauldrons of the laboratory began. Silver retention was a process that Darius had used many times on the print, and they very much wanted this look for the movie Seven. I probably should explain what silver retention is. In a simple way of looking at it, film is processed through various solutions. Each bath is responsible for a particular constituent to be either washed out or remain in the film. When you get to the bleaching and fixing process, you bleach out the film and fix it, which releases all the silver that's not been used from the image into solutions. They were able at Technicolor to create this process, which they call E&R, to use a black and white developer after the fix, before you bleach, so that you could actually retain more of that silver in the film and create a muted color, but a very black image on the film. You can monitor and also dial in the particular level that you want based on the concentration of the black and white developer. David and Darius, of course, wanted a very black and a very desaturated image because, of course, it lended itself for the subject matter of the movie. So Deluxe began to do dailies on the silver retention process, and then we actually started doing release prints also, which in the past, laboratories had done a few here, a few there, but never an entire process. I was excited because I love chemistry, but I also love filmmaking. And this kind of began my adventure to where I started meeting more and more cameramen and more directors, and thus began sort of my specialty of hand-holding a movie from beginning to end. And if I couldn't help them, I made sure I found out who in the lab could. But it was a exciting time.
Yeah, it was always really great because you were the one person that you could contact and you would know who should deal with it and you could get them going and all of that. And it was so wonderful to have one person who also understood what the issues were. So you were highly technical, but you also knew the structure of the lab and you understood what we were trying to do. So it was really great. And we miss you a lot. That's all I'm going to say.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, it was interesting. I kind of think we first talked, even if we didn't meet, when I was doing Courage Under Fire, and I was pulling the development a stop and overexposing the negative by like 2.5 stops. So I still had a hell of a thick negative. And it was something that I did from talking with Connie Hall, who had done something similar on a film called Tell 'em Willie Boy is Here, where he just exposed the hell out of the negative and got this wonderful sort of slightly desaturated kind of blown out image. It was really gorgeous. But a lot of it was really interesting back then, wasn't it? It was a lot of cinematographers were just trying different techniques. And I just out of interest on the skip bleach, I mean, there's a lot of different terms for it. I never quite understood the differences, but there are differences between the process you're talking about that Technicolor in Rome, I think, developed, which was a black and white developer after the bleach, yes, and to bring back some of the silver. Now, I can never find out, maybe somebody knows, but Keizo Miyagawa first used a process in 1960, would you believe it, on a film called Her Brother for Konichigawa, and he called it silver tint. And Konichigawa was, Keizo Miyagawa, the cinematographer who shot a lot of Kurosawa's films. He was a chemist before he became a cinematographer, apparently. And he developed this process himself with a Daihatsu lab, is it out there? Anyway, and I've never found out whether he did it on the print, the negative, or the IP, or what. I never understood. But we knew that, I would say I was working with a little lab in England when we were doing 1984, and they had heard of these different processes. But then they came up with an idea of just doing it on the print, which is different again, isn't it? You know, where you actually skip bleach on the print. So everything else is the same.
The problem with doing it that way is that sometimes further down the line, there is actually a true color negative, as you know, in 1984. Yes. And then you see prints that didn't do that, didn't do the bleach bypass on the processing. So
it was only like 2 years ago, I managed to do another pass of 1984 for a Blu-ray that actually reflects the true intent and the original print. It was a full skip bleach, which is like a 50%, right? A 50% black and white image. So it's interesting, all these different things.
It's funny because I always hated the term skip bleach because in the processes that we did at Deluxe, we did not skip the bleach except on very crude images, and it had to do with the intermediate. You know, there were a full skip bleach on the intermediate or a one rack skip bleach on the intermediate. But the full skip bleach is a very, very dense, very silver retained. For example, there's a way of reading the amount of silver that's in a print on an IR spectrum on a densitometer. On a normal print, just to kind of give some perspective, on a normal print, the IR level is around 60. When we did 7, the IR reading, or excuse me, take that back, it was 50. When you do a full skip bleach on the print, you're up to about 240 in IR reading. On 7, we were around 110. So you're really a long way from a full skip. A full skip, it's almost black and white. And then when you start getting into original negative where you do a skip, bleach. Of course, that's a whole nother, genre of looks and images. And you really have to shoot for that, as you can imagine.
And you have to be pretty brave to do that, because that is your negative.
Yes, yeah. I mean, that's very dangerous on the negative. But the printing process is interesting because, I mean, we did it on 1984, but sometimes the film, because you got so much silver in the print, that when it was being projected, sometimes it would burst into flames because the amount of heat build up in the projection mechanism. It would, so they'd have to check the screenings to make sure it was all right in the projector. I mean, I was in a screening once where that happened, but luckily when it got released, I mean, it didn't have a huge wide release, but when it did get released, they didn't. Well,
for health, but for public safety, that's all.
But it didn't have any problem as far as I understood. But it's interesting because actually the whole idea of it, I think, went back to, say, Ozzie Morris doing Moby Dick when it was a Technicolor process. I don't know if you know about that, where it was a 3-strip. So they're basically printing the 3 different dyes, right? But he took one and did a black and white layer on top of the dyes on Moby Dick with John Huston. So that was something that actually I remember people talking about and going, wow, that was amazing. And I think that really, hit both Ozzie Morris and Keizo Miyagawa really sort of pushed the sort of idea of treating the negative or the print or the image in some way to get a look that is not totally naturalistic, but puts the audience in a world of its own. You know what I mean?
Yes, I do. And in fact, I did a couple of tests, not with the 3-strip, but with the old, where you bipack a dupe negative with a colored dupe negative and a black and white dupe negative to create kind of that look. I remember I did that once for Jonathan Demme, rest his soul. And it was beautiful. But what happened, as you well know, Roger, is the creativity is somewhat stunted by the release. In the old days, I mean, that's really why the Technicolor 3-strip process went out of works, is because we went from a time where you needed, instead of needing 500 release prints, you needed 10,000, and there were worldwide releases. And nobody wanted to wait to take the time to do the kind of necessary work to create those images, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah. I remember we did a double pass on a print, if that makes sense. So we had 2 negatives and lined them up. So one was color and one was black and white, and then we timed it between those 2 negatives. But then you think, in a film process, that the registration and then the fact you've got to run it twice, and then the idea of doing that on a major release, it was fine if you were showing it for film festivals or something, but on a major release it was like you couldn't. I mean, because I remember we did look at some tests of that on 1984 and thought, my God, we can't go that way. It's just too complicated.
And speaking of black and white, I'm sure you remember when we were doing Man Who Wasn't There, all the testing that we had to do there, because for those of you who don't know, we released it in black and white, but we had to shoot it contractually on color because some of the European distribution contracts said we needed to be able to supply a color negative. We knew that we had to find a way to get a good black and white, so we turned to Bev. So Bev.
But I think I just want to say on that, I think though Bev, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we'd have gone that way anyway. I know that what James says is right. In Europe, that contractually we had to produce a color version for VHS, or for television distribution. But I kind of think we did a lot of tests, didn't we? I think we would have gone that way anyway. By the time I knew that on the contract, I think we had already settled on a color negative and doing intermediaries.
What I remember is that you did not really like the way Tri-X and Plus X looked in the testing. It didn't give you the richness that you wanted, especially when printed on black and white. It didn't have the depth that you wanted. And you said, I think I'm going to shoot color negative. That's what I remember. I agree with you. I think you decided you were going to shoot a color negative.
I didn't want a feeling of an old black and white movie. I wanted a feeling of a modern black and white movie, if that makes sense. I didn't want the grain. So remember, we shot on what was it, 7222? It was a fine grain 200 ASA stock.
Correct.
I think that was what we 5222. Yeah, it was a fine grain 200 ASA.
Yeah, and it looked gorgeous.
Yes, because it was the way we found to get the least grain and the best, and it was low contrast because of the processing that you came up with. It helped all the way through the process, didn't it? Having slightly less contrast in the negative.
Yes, because the 5369, which was the high contrast, panachromatic black and white film, had so much contrast, but it gave you the rich blacks that you wanted and the depth. To marry that with the lower contrast negative, it looked fantastic. I mean, that was a great day when Roger looked at it and said, "This is what I want." And then it was like, okay, great. Now, how the hell are we going to get this to the release?
Yeah.
Weren't the show prints, the prints off of the A and B neg, printed on one stock, and then the release prints were printed on another stock?
Yeah, the release prints or show prints, the show prints were actually printed on 5369, the same thing that Roger okayed for his dailies, because that was the look that he wanted. And as far as the release prints were concerned, while Roger was shooting the movie, Mary and I, my cohort, spent months working out a plan, and we were able to finally make Roger happy. And what we did was we took a color negative, and we knew we had to make an IP and an IN, and we also knew that we were going to have to put it on a color print stock. So the whole concept, as of normal, is to go from a color image to a black and white image within the IP-IN step. That's interpositive, internegative before release print. And after numerous tests and bringing Roger in and him looking at it go, no, that's not good enough. Let's go back to the grindstone and figure something out. We were able to come up with this step that I have to say did look beautiful. We went from color negative to a black and white 5366, which is a fine grain dupe titling stock. And that's kind of the normal process if you want to go from color to black and white. But then we took the 5366. Again, now we have to end up on a color negative because we're going to be printing from a color negative to color print stock. We did 5244, which was the IN stock. And if you're out there listening, one of the problems you always have when you go from black and white to color is that the contrast of the IN stock, when printed onto print stock, color print stock, you will end up with either cyan highlights or magenta shadows. And what we were able to do was find a way to pivot it to neutralize it. And believe it or not, we did one rack of silver retention on that IN. We put silver in it to increase the contrast past that point of where the pivoting causes a problem. And then we printed it onto Premiere stock. Premiere, because Kodak's Premiere stock, because it had a really high amount of silver in it and had rich blacks, would bring Roger back to that look of the 5369. So that was the process that we used to create that look.
All right. What a great memory. I couldn't remember all those numbers. Yeah, that was brilliant though. What you did. I mean, why you were so brilliant, why we so many of us needed you, was that you, from my point of view, you were the one person in Hollywood that was actually excited by doing it and loved playing with these things and loved helping us create a look. We were all doing it together. It was quite a wonderful experience.
Also being absolutely dogmatic about it, not stopping, non-stopping until you got the answer, which was really wonderful.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, it was just such...
Well, I just like to say this, people... It's so funny because younger people these days, all they talk about was, oh, you worked on all these movies and how great that must have been. And I'm like, yeah, it was great. I mean, because it was the opportunity to help you create the look. I said, but it was never about my ideas about a look. I said, filmmakers come in, they know exactly what they're doing, exactly what they want. I'm simply trying to help to get it to the screen. What you just said to me, Roger, is all the appreciation I ever wanted to get. Because again, you came to our facility, you were loyal to us, and we had a great time doing it. And I was so proud to, in some way, small part, be a part of it. But, nowadays kids say to me, well, how come I don't see your credit on any of these movies? And I'm like, what does a credit have to do with it? I said, if there's a little teeny piece that I'm adding to the, I mean, people don't get it. I guess the point is just people get things kind of screwed up. I did it because it was my job and I love doing it. And to have you say what you just said is all the reward I ever wanted in my career. So thank you.
No, I mean, that's why we all do it, isn't it? That's the joy of it. That's why we all do it. That's why, Mitch, my key grip, or Bruce, or Andy, that's why we all do it, isn't it? It's that creating something that suddenly you see that image and it's what you're all trying to achieve, and it's a real high.
Bev, speaking of young filmmakers, myself included, a lot of people today really don't understand or know anything about the film process, right? Like I grew up, maybe my mom had a film camera, but aside from that, digital is something that people are growing up learning. Could you explain the process of processing film, I guess, and how that, just from A to B, how that happens, and a little bit of the chemistry in it for people who don't know anything?
Oh God, you make me feel like I'm 100 all of a sudden. No, of course. Film camera negative is shot on a camera and brought to the laboratory in cans that have been taped shut. And there was a processing machine that had a dark end, it had an operator, and that operator would, in the dark, and only his or her sense of feel, would unload those cans of film and attach them, splice them onto a machine so that the film can run through the various baths and be developed. With camera negative, you guys know it had backing on it. Rimjet, it was called. It was the black backing on the back of the film, which was necessary for the film, one, to run through the camera with ease, but also it had to do with make sure there was no light reflections. In other words, if you imagine a piece of film as my hand, the light comes here. If the light goes through and there's nothing to absorb it, it can actually reflect back, and that you end up with your images having soft edges because it's not being stopped. So rimjet was on the back side of the film so it would absorb that light once it was exposed. So the first step was to take rimjet off the back of the film. So there was like a pre-bath solution that the film would actually travel through. The rimjet would come off, and then it would actually go directly into the developer. There was a 3-minute development time where the images would develop up, and then it would go into a pH of 3 for the stop bath, which basically did exactly what it did. It stopped the development because after the 3 minutes, all of the image that's supposed to be developed has been developed. You would stop bath, and then you would go through various wash tanks, and then you would go through a bleaching step, which is to take the silver that you don't want in the negative out, and then a fixer, which would actually, you would make a compound that would come out of solution, and then you would actually go into a wash, and then you would go through a very long dry process so that once on the end of the dry box, the film would be taken up. Of course, after the stop bath, you would actually come into a well-lit area so that the processing technicians could watch the machine. I mean, if you think about it, the negative was gold. You certainly didn't want to have anything happen to the negative. So there were people walking the machine, listening. I mean, some of these old guys were amazing. They could listen to a machine and tell when something wasn't right. So they were walking the floor, listening to the machines, watching the machines, and then the film would come up dry on the other end, and it would wind back up into a reel. That's basically how films developed. And then it would go through various processes. You put leader on it, it would go upstairs. The footage you would go through, there was somebody looking for torn perfs. They would document all the slates. I mean, it was a pretty extensive process when you think about it from a daily standpoint. Each day that was done, each morning or night, that film would come in, and then you'd have to produce something through the laboratory that was clear, because in those days, which again, I loved, you go to the lab at 4:00 in the morning, anytime between like 4 and 6, directors of photography were walking in the lab because a lot of them wanted to come in and look at their dailies. They would go into a screening room, they would look at those prints, and you would listen to the director of photography. They may not like quite where you printed it. They thought maybe it was a little light or the color was a little off. So you would get a reprint going, because what you wanted to do was to please the cinematographer and make sure your images was what he or she wanted, because they were going to probably look at those prints at lunchtime, on the shoot, or later. So the laboratory would reprint those, usually at no charge to the client, because what we needed to do, especially at the beginning, was have the color timer or the Hazeltine timer who was timing, say, Roger's show, dial in to get to the image, the look that Roger wanted during those first weeks, so that as the production went on, it was, pretty easy to communicate. Maybe if there was special notes or a call would happen. I mean, that was an exciting time because you were face to face usually with the cinematographer, and you were looking at the same screen, making decisions about what you wanted to do in order to create that look.
One other thing about the film days that's so different than now is that film, you had to be so careful about cleanliness, because emulsion sometimes seemed like a magnet for any kind of dust or anything. So as opposed to today where you get it on a drive and it is what it is, every step along the way, which kind of made or broke some labs, because some labs, if they didn't have that cleanliness protocol in, you could tell the difference because your dailies were speckly. So it was a big pressure on the lab not to, they're handling the negative so much, but you have to keep it clean.
Yeah, because we're talking about this in the past. It's not completely in the past because people are still shooting film, but they're not many people are watching dailies, are they? That's the thing. They're shooting on film negative, and then that negative is scanned, and then they watch digital dailies for the most part. And maybe Chris Nolan is still watching dailies. I'm not sure, but I think he is. But very few people have that experience of watching dailies. And that's what I miss most, actually, about the change. I miss not the 6 o'clock in the morning dailies, but I miss watching dailies with the director and maybe the actors. You know what I mean? Everybody, the sense that the whole crew is together watching these, whether it's with you guys at the lab or if you're on location, it'll be at a local theater or something at the end of the day. And there's something about the camaraderie that you had in those situations that you don't get now, because you see the image on set and everybody goes at the end of the day, okay, we got that. They don't need to watch it, or they might watch it on their laptop just to check performance or something, specific, but not the way we used to all sit together and watch dailies.
And speaking about digital versus film, tell us about your journey, because you were so film-based and then digital started to come in, and how you made that transition over.
It was kind of interesting because I started seeing digital reels coming in from the few DI facilities that were in Los Angeles. I was in charge of the chemical department and the control department. The control department were the people who kept all the printers and the developers in control. And there was this new thing called LAD aims, laboratory aim densities, which were densities that had to be communicated between you and various facilities, because they had a film recorder and they were going to be recording out reels of the films from this thing called a digital intermediate. And we started seeing facilities come in with these numbers, and some were consistent and some weren't. And then we did a film called Pleasantville that I almost lost my mind on because we had to do lat aim densities for the whole release. As you can imagine, when you're doing just dailies, it's one thing, but when you're doing the whole laboratory and you have to keep these very fine controls, because if you don't, the reel itself doesn't look the way it was supposed to. So we had to go to school on learning what this digital intermediate was about. We got through Pleasantville, and then I said to the president, who was my boss, I said, we got to get into this digital intermediate thing. And my suggestion is not to create it, but to buy a company that knows what they're doing. And some of them know what they're doing. He said, well, who knows what they're doing? I said, there's this place called eFilm, which I think is incredible. Their lat aim densities are right on the money all the time. And we don't have any problems with their colorists complaining about lat aim densities and the look. I said, I think we should buy them. And he laughed at me. And I said, why are you laughing? He said, I'm two weeks away from closing the deal. And I'm like, you're kidding. That's fantastic. So after we purchased it, he said, okay, Bev, now you need to go over there and figure out what this thing is all about. So I was like, huh? He said, you need to go figure it out because you're going to have cinematographers expecting you to help, hold their hand over there. So eFilm is funny. eFilm is actually 2 miles away from Deluxe. So I started walking over there every day. I'd take my phone. I wouldn't take my purse or anything. And I just walk over there every day and start sitting in the rooms and start meeting people. And it was so funny because we had done, I don't know how I skipped over this, but at Deluxe, I had some contact with the DI because Roger had done Oh Brother. And it was not at eFilm, but I felt that it was important to understand the difference between eFilm, Cinesite, and the various other places. And of course, when I got to eFilm, the first thing they kept saying to me, when are you bringing Roger Deakins over here? I said, I'm not bringing Roger Deakins over here. I said, if Roger Deakins says to me he wants to do a DI, I will bring him here. I said, but he left with a bad taste in his mouth on Oh Brother and the process.
He swore he would never do another DI.
I've sworn a lot of things after a movie, yeah.
I said, I am not going to bring it up. Roger, let me tell you, of all the years that I've known you, I have never seen you as upset as you were on Oh Brother. And I kept telling the people at eFilm, I'm not bringing up a DI with him until he's ready. Then I'll bring him to eFilm.
Yeah, well, that wasn't the easiest experience. It was incredibly frustrating. But the technology changed so quickly, didn't it? That was the thing. I forget what I did after Oh Brother, but
it's interesting because when I told you all we'll do is use the original the negative that they created for us. It's just like a cut negative. Everything's not in the same spot. Let's time it like a regular negative, and then it'll be okay. And you're like, we can do that? I'm like, yes, we can do that. And that's how we were able to finish that film, which of course was beautiful because you knew what you were doing. And they certainly knew 50% of what they were doing. They just hadn't gotten the technology down yet about how to record it out and have it all be the same.
Yeah, I mean, that was a frustration. I think to be clear about the whole process, it was Cinesite was doing the DI, but it was a virtual data cine, so you couldn't record the timing you did. If you had a reel up and you were trying to time it, you couldn't record that at the end of the day. You had to wait till you had a final timing of the whole reel, and then you laid it down.
And also, you had the original negative up. And so negative, as you were going back and forth, you were doing that on the negative,
the
which
negative
is horrible.
Was going back and forth, and you could see it sitting there on the reels while you're timing the film. It was a nightmare. And then we did that for like 11 weeks, right? And then sometimes we would spend 4 or 5 days timing a reel, then a power would go out.
And it would crash, and we would lose an entire reel.
So the frustration... Yeah, I mean, the frustration wasn't the people. It was the frustration was, the technology wasn't quite where you needed it, But we couldn't have done it any other way. And it was, retrospectively, I'm absolutely glad to have done it that way. But
so after that one, after Oh Brother, what was the next DI? Because I know the next DI we came to you at eFilm. Do you remember what the first one?
I think it was Intolerable Cruelty, wasn't it?
That
wasn't that the
sounds
first?
right.
Oh, maybe, yeah.
That sounds right.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I had worked on several ones at eFilm. The first one that we did when we became Deluxe is We Were Soldiers with Dean Simler, and we had done that many, many times. And it was interesting because that's when I first encountered that there was a change. The relationship between myself and the cinematographer was usually that you worked, and then at the end of the process, you came in and you looked at it with the director. However, on We Were Soldiers, it became a director and a DP and an editor medium. In fact, we did that DI, I think 2 or 3 times, because the DP, Dean, had a look that he wanted and he got agreement on, and we did the DI. But then the director came in and he wanted a whole nother look. So I think we actually did that movie twice in a DI. And I said to the guys there, I said, there's a change here in the creative process, and I'm not sure I like it. Because from my standpoint, it is a it is a DP's medium. You have to give the DP the time to get their look down and go through the process. Of course, you bring the director in and have them look at stuff, and yeah, that's good. But all of a sudden, directors started saying, I can dial this, I can do this, I can do that. And Roger never had to put up with that because his director knew he was going to do what he needed to do. And you basically had the control of that medium. But with a lot of other cinematographers and a lot of other shows, it became this communal thing where it took forever sometimes to get a DI done because everybody had an opinion. Everybody wanted to dial it in. Everybody wanted to learn it. And that was just I think that's the beginning of the creative process really changing for a lot of people.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't realize that was so prevalent because, as you said, I've never really worked like that. I mean, I'm never really worried about it because the director's always said, well, you do that, I'm doing the sound mix or something, I'll concentrate on that, and then I'll come and see when you've done it.
It's also, when we're shooting, I end up talking to the post super and everything and explaining to him this is normally the way that we do it, and getting them to agree to it, so when we get into post there's no surprise. And usually the director, who at that point in time is oftentimes working on the mix, is fine if you pull it all together.
I just think we've always worked so closely with a director and prep and all the way through that we're like a team. It's not like we're in competition. Which it's sad that you say that seems to have been quite prevalent. I'm surprised.
Well, it's sad because there were tough days where you would work with a cinematographer and a director, and then the director would sometimes call you afterwards and say, "Don't do what the DP says. Do what I say," and that was foreign to us, but you had to learn how to, manage that. Usually brought in the studio and said, look, you got to help us get through this. But, that was never the case with you, which is why it was always a pleasure to work with you. Your images were always perfect, and we were just, again, enhancing it. It's the same process that we did at the lab. You knew exactly what you wanted. And what we had to do was make sure we could give it to you and give it to you consistently, which is, when you think about it, Matt, thinking about you saying people who never used film, I just want to add this comment. I look at cinematographers, and I was lucky enough to touch the helm of the coat of a lot of people over the years. And when you meet the masters like Roger, one of the things you understand quickly is that they learned film. They learned their emulsions. They knew what that emulsion would do. They knew which emulsion, film emulsion, to pick. They understood that curve shape. They knew how to light it. They knew how to shoot it. When we went to digital, I think the best, again, one of them's on the end of this. he looked at the digital camera and said, it's an emulsion. I'm going to learn everything I want to do, learn about the emulsion, and I'm going to create that look with this camera. And that's my advice to young people, is that you have to learn the digital camera. And the key point is learn it so you don't make mistakes. You know, what I hated was cinematographers coming in saying, oh, we'll fix it in post. You know, that was the new term that I heard more than I cared to hear when DIs came about. Oh, don't worry, we'll fix it in post. And I'm like, wait a minute, what happened to aiming for bullseye and getting what you wanted in the camera? I mean, that was the pleasure of working with people like Roger. It's like he knew exactly what he was doing. And that's what I tell young people. If it's a red camera, it's an Arri camera, I don't care what it is. If it's your iPhone, know what it can do and have control over that. And if you do that, you'll never feel uncomfortable with your images.
I think there's something about learning film is about learning color science. I mean, color science is the same, whatever medium you're using, really, isn't it? You know, and if you understand the mixing of colors, I mean, color science in the lab is the same as using gels on a camera or on a light. And there was a question on the website there yesterday and said, well, why don't you just do it in post? Why do you create that color on the set? And there's no understanding that if you've got an orange light coming from the back of the set and you want a blue light in the foreground or a green light in the foreground, you can't do that in post. I mean, unless you're doing a whole 3D animation and relighting it, that light is never going to light the face by doing it as like a Photoshop kind of conversion. It's never going to do it in the same way as it does in camera. And I think learning film, you have to learn that color science. And I think now that's getting a bit lost.
Yeah, it seems like a big problem that if you're not understanding the fundamentals of it, you're almost handicapping yourself and you're just hoping that somebody else can fix that problem later on. And it's similar, like James, you, or even Roger, we've talked about exposure. If you just go on and think you get an okay exposure, and then you come to realize that and you're trying to match it with something, but it's not quite there, it's going to be harder to match that. And you might have some skin tones that aren't exactly right. Whereas some people might get lazy and just say, oh, no, it looks pretty good on the monitor, but they're not taking the time to actually do the things that can get it right in camera. Yeah.
I suppose now I tend to rely on the monitor probably more than I should. I mean, I still take light readings, for instance, because that's just, I'm a creature of habit, I guess, but I don't take as many as I think I should. And it's not getting sloppy. It's just, it is probably getting sloppy. Well, I'm looking at the monitor.
You know what to look for in a monitor. And also you've got Josh there looking at the graphs. So right. If anything's sort of out of line, right, he'll be popping up and letting you know.
But I think it is coming from film, it's understanding the color separation and the sort of the highlight shadow kind of relationship, and not just recording a flat image that I'm going to play with in Photoshop or DI equivalent. Yeah. You know, there's a lot about film that I really miss. I miss the people, Bev. Miss you, for God's sake.
We
and
miss
Mary,
you a lot.
I miss Mary too.
Yeah,
but it's different, isn't it? It's different. On the other hand, it has opened up so many possibilities of doing things that we struggled to do in the lab. You know, like the overexposure, the bleach bypass, the separation of colors, and I mean, you can do anything really.
So DIs came into place, and that was the first thing that you were working with eFilm. When was the shift of the work to dailies? In other words, when you went to eFilm, were they also dealing with digital dailies at that time? I know it's certainly more prevalent now.
Yes, they were. There weren't many though, because we started out sort of slow in the process. But yes, it sort of ramped up. There were multiple, after We Were Soldiers came out, then there were multiple DIs going on, and people started saying, I don't need to look at a print anymore. Because a lot of days I would most every day I started out at the lab, and sometimes I would look at film dailies and then come over to eFilm, and look at digital dailies because they were doing both. And then soon they just said, we don't want the expense of film dailies. So I would end up going to the lab in the morning and then going directly to eFilm and start looking at digital dailies and understanding that process. And again, it was the same concept, but what I was plagued with, and James, probably you more than Roger, because we would sit in the middle. I mean, you would learn where there were problems when you thought everything was okay. You thought the workflow was perfect, and what you see is what you get, and that we had to troubleshoot and figure out what's wrong. Something's not right. The monitor's not right, or two people aren't looking at the same thing, or the type of monitor that they have here. I mean, that was a nightmare. Whereas in the old days, you could look at a print together in the laboratory. You got the DP there, you got the colorist there, you're looking at the same thing. Now we got digital dailies. Normally, of course, the DP wasn't at eFilm, but you got a colorist looking at a monitor making decisions, and then them creating the dailies, and somehow there was a monitor on set and there was a monitor in somebody's trailer, and all of a sudden nothing matches. I mean, that was a tough time when the technology hadn't grown to where we needed to understand how, I mean, and that's really what I think what made eFilm better at it is they realized that they had to sort of go in and make sure that all of those areas matched, because if you didn't, you were lost.
Yeah, I think there's another shift that I was very aware of early on when, you know, it's getting digital dailies, the power of the process. Whereas, you know, like getting film dailies, I could talk to the timer or you and say, oh, you know, that's 2 points too bright, or it's a point too yellow, or 5 points too yellow. I had a scale. There was something very concrete about the color science and the exposure. It was there were numbers, you know, that made sense. And now there is none of that. It's like, and there's so much power in the hands of the timer that if that timer doesn't know, if you haven't done tests and that timer doesn't know you and what you're shooting, how does that timer, he or she, know what that image should look like? Because they could get the digital negative and it could go anywhere. You couldn't do that with film. There was always, okay, we're going to print the negative close to the mid-range numbers. Or you might say me, Roger Deakins, or Conrad Hall would have done. Maybe the lights will be very high. But the timer would know what you were trying to achieve. But it's very hard now. There's so much, you know,
I think it's
power.
Interesting, too, because when you work with a timer, even a timer that you know, and they've just come off another movie, let's say
Right.
a Marvel movie or something,
Right.
and you're in dailies, and I say to them, well, he wants just a little bit more blue, and wham, there's a lot of blue. But I understand, because in Marvel, that's probably what they meant.
Yeah, it's extremes. But
yeah.
I'm really
You're
talking about a point, but
yeah.
they don't know what a point is.
Yeah.
Is a point
Yeah.
100%? Or,
Yeah.
you know what I mean?
You know, Roger, you're right. When you said it like that, I remember you're right, because I remember we were all trying to figure it out if there was a way we could come up with sort of a transition. Like, I mean, you're right. A colorist or color timer would say, you'd say, you know, how about a half a stop? And they're like, what's a stop?
Yeah,
Or
really,
a
yeah.
half a printer point. What's a printer point? And it was like, how could we come up with some sort of standard that would help? And we were never able to come up with something, a regimented program that would give you exactly what you wanted. It was about familiarity between your work and what you meant, you know, when you said a little bit brighter or a little bit darker. Yeah. And James, I have to say, during those days, it was great having you there, because you were Roger's eyes, and, you know, you helped dial us in. If we hadn't had you, we would have been lost. And that's the truth.
Well, thank you. But also, though, you did, I know on the Luster and the DI suite, you really worked on having that click system,
Right.
as opposed to working on the
That's
wheel.
interesting. I was just going to
Yeah,
say that.
so-
I loved having the click system.
Because you knew what half a click was.
A couple of clicks, mate. You know.
Right.
I worry that people haven't had this film experience. I mean, I'm not nostalgic for film in that sense. But if you don't have the education, it's still about the color science. And okay, you look at an image and think, why isn't that quite right? Well, to me, I look at something and say, well, it needs a point of yellow or it needs a point of green. But does somebody that hasn't had that experience of film and color science then relate to the image in the same way now, to a digital image? Because I don't think they do.
Yeah, and it makes such a difference. Like sometimes when you put that tiny little point of yellow in, it changes the whole image. Yeah, it's just amazing.
It's like Matt sometimes about skin tones, but sometimes, a skin tone might be a little too red or something, but sometimes you can take that red out without affecting the rest of the image because there's no red in it. You know what I mean? You don't actually, you see that from lab timing and this simple, RGB sort of timing.
Well, and it's true. And if you can do it overall, I think that's a better solution.
Yeah.
And to get what you want than doing a million windows, because that way leads to trouble.
We learned that early on doing Oh Brother, didn't we? Because you'd start putting a window in and then, that's not right. And then you put another one in to fix that. And then you put another one to fix. It's rather like lighting. When you start putting too many lights in, you get too many flags. And then you've got to go and have a cup of coffee and turn around and look at it and see what a kind of chaos you created. And then you've got to realize, no, the initial idea was wrong. You've gone down. You're trying to fix something that in the wrong way. You've got to go back to start and find a simpler way of doing it. That's how I feel anyway. I
also think, too, the problem with Windows in this day and age where at the very end of the process anyway, sometimes they recut, or the visual effects changes the frame count a little bit. And so suddenly those windows need to be adjusted. But sometimes we're looking at something and we go, this doesn't look right. Why? And we find out that one of the windows didn't get adjusted completely.
Yeah,
and that's really hard to see.
Yeah. Which was quite a big thing in 1917.
Oh God,
we didn't have many windows in it, but every so often we would watch
something wasn't right.
Watch the shot because it was one, but suddenly the window would jump where the join was because they changed the cut and the timeline had changed, but the windows hadn't gone with it.
And they also changed the speed of it at a time. They did a little bit of re-speed on it, and that just because in essence, 1917 was one take. It just screwed everything up.
Yeah.
Hey guys, before we leave this whole concept, there's one other point I want to make with Matt about film that was interesting, and it was an indication of how good your DP was. A good DP would start, they dial in their movie where they're going to expose it, and they would come up with a set of lights that they'd like to have, RGB, a value of what those lights were on those dailies, and it looked good. And on day one, you would have that set of lights and you could shoot for 100 days and that DP would still be on that same set of lights. That's how exacting they were to control where on the curve of that negative they were exposing. And in your realm, you need to be able to do the same thing on your digital camera. It's basically where you are on that camera on day one is where you should be to some relative sense at the end of your shooting, rather than kind of all over the place. Because you got to remember, it's all got to come back in to be in the same DI.
Just because there's a million settings doesn't mean you have to use them all.
Thank you. Thank you.
I've got a question for you. What would you say, just from your experiences, the worst mistakes cinematographers can make from what you've seen come into the lab and that you've had to correct?
I guess, when you talk about whether it's film exposure or digital exposure, what I found is that, and I say this lovingly, there were a lot of cinematographers working who did not have a well-exposed negative. And you were always trying to get them to change it a little bit so that you wouldn't be in trouble. And those same cinematographers went to the digital arena and did the same thing. And that's what made me cringe, because in the digital arena, certain things could be fixed, but a lot of things created noise, which you were always going to see at a later time. And it was hard sometimes for me to sit and talk to a DP when they were not exposing things the way they were supposed to, but I tried to help them. I just one-on-one saying, you're on the edge here and you're going to get into trouble. And you may be able to have gotten away with it on film, but you're not going to be able to get away with it on digital. And that was the thing that caused me a lot of angst. I mean, and you knew that some of those people sometimes got fired on a show. I mean, it didn't happen a lot, but it did happen sometimes because they were so concerned about trying to expose their negative that they didn't pay attention to some of the things that maybe the director wanted. And it got to be really hairy when it got to digital because you could see easily when people weren't exactly sure where they were.
Yeah, I heard, I don't know if you were involved, some of them probably were, but I heard a number of stories where, a production was out on location shooting, maybe abroad somewhere, and they would be watching dailies on a small monitor or TV set, whatever, and it would all look fine. But when they came back and watched it on a screen, it was all like noisy as hell. And you couldn't get the right color balance because they're watching on a little monitor and the timer, bless him, the dailies timer has pulled up the image and put it where he thinks the cinematographer wants to be. And everybody's happy, but then they see it on a big screen and it looks like rubbish because you can't really see the details on a small monitor watching dailies. And nobody was catching it,
You're exactly right, Roger. I was involved in a lot of those. And like you said, the dailies timer would do their job and try to make the DP's work look good, which they always wanted to do. And like you said, because it was a small monitor, you couldn't see it. And then you come out. I had that happen a lot. And it was scary. Because what the hell are you going to do? The movie's over. It's already been shot, and now you've assembled it, and they've scanned the negative, and they're like saying, "What happened to it?"
So then it's a huge expense of noise reduction and sharpening and all these processes trying to get that image back so it's viewable on a big screen, and all that comes because you don't have printer lights. It's a very simple thing. You don't have RGB printer lights. So when you were doing film, you knew if it was like, what was it, 27, 31, 32 was probably where I was, which is a bit above normal maybe. I knew if I was 42, 45, I was still fine. But if I was 18, 20, 21 or whatever, or 18, 50, something was seriously wrong, It never was, thankfully. But I mean, you had a scale and you could see the image. I could be in Kenya watching a VHS at night around a campfire with Bob Rafelson and look at this and think, oh, that's okay. I know my printer lights are all right. The first thing I looked at was my printer lights, not the dailies,
And Mountains of the Moon was gorgeous, by the way.
A few grainy shots, but there you go. but again, the limitations. I say a few grainy shots. There are, you stretch it sometimes and you go for a shot and think, oh, I can't got time for the meter reading. I'll just see where I can go and judge it by eye. And that's what you got used to shooting film. You kind of had to. But now looking at some people will look at the little monitor on the camera. They don't have a DIT like we have. They don't have Josh and a calibrated monitor. They're looking at the monitor on the top of their camera. I don't really think it's not the best.
And what were some of the other hard situations that would pop up in post afterwards? I mean, I know obviously exposure is a big thing. What else? Can you think of anything?
Well, I think that the studio, of course, wanted us to get them in and get them out because DIs were very expensive in those days when it first started. Usually you had 2 weeks to get it done. So they wanted us to make sure the DP was happy, the director was happy, the editor was happy. And I touched upon earlier how sometimes it was difficult because the director had dailies that they had been using to cut the movie. And maybe those digital dailies weren't exactly what the DP wanted. So the director has gotten used to the look of his edited, quote unquote, work picture that he's created his movie. And the director of photography comes in and says, no, we meant that to be a little this and a little down. And all of a sudden in the DI process, the director's looking at it going, this isn't the look that I want for this movie. That was a very difficult time because it would sometimes add a lot more time onto the process. You've color timed it with the DP, and then the director comes in and says, that's not the movie that I want to release. I want to go match the dailies.
Yeah, there's another thing that I found a little bit of, and I don't know how much this happens across filmmaking on other films, but, the director and editor sit with a cutting copy now in the Avid or whatever, and they can retime it as they go. And I've noticed sometimes that I'm looking at a cut of a film and think, well, why is that being retimed that way? And I've never had that problem in the end, because I time the film. But you sort of see it, and maybe the editor will say, well, I adjusted that because it didn't feel right with such and such. But you adjusted that, and the director's got it, and now it's all in your head. That's the way it is. You know what I mean? It's like where the cinematographer is in that world is getting a little bit. And then I hear a lot that cinematography is not actually timing the movie anymore. They don't actually go. The director times it, or just the timer times it, and the cinematographer's not there.
There have been times where an editor has come up to us and said, yeah, no, I love timing movies.
Do editors really time movies? I mean, I've never had that, but...
That's when I left in November of 2015. Yeah, I left. That's one of the reasons, even though I was running eFilm, I still spent some time in the screening rooms, and I could see, again, when I saw it happen at the first one, now it really was becoming a visual effects person and an editor. I mean, it was their medium rather than the director of photography. Because like you said, maybe the director of photography was off shooting another movie, or maybe they were saying, well, we'll bring him in before we're finished. And you're like, huh? So that whole concept of whose medium really is it became very clouded. And it was, like I said, a lot of films at eFilm were color timed by a visual effects person and an editor and a director. And the DP was only brought in as a secondary issue. And that became really kind of cumbersome, because you reach a point where you're not sure, they don't understand the negative or the quote unquote the digital shooting the way the DP did, and they would always try to do stuff and noise would come up, and they're looking at you like, why is this noise coming up? Something's wrong with you. So it became a bit of a nightmare, because of course the studio is telling us make them happy. And it's like, well, which one? So it became very difficult.
And also, when you think about it, you hire the DP to oversee the visual. I mean, this is our viewpoint. And generally, we're pretty clear about that in the beginning. And we also, which is why we also ask to see the visual effects along the way while there's still time to change it. But that's to make sure that the visual doesn't change at that point, that suddenly there's a shot in that visual effects worked on that looks completely different than the overall look. And I think it's better for the movie if there's this consistent visual to it. And of course, it means that you have to have gotten along with the director up till the end too. So otherwise they will kick you up.
Yeah, no, but it's always been about that. It's about relationships, that's what James says. We're always trying to get to know the visual effects supervisors and artists, and it was the same. Like, you get to know the production designer and the art directors and the set dresser. You really need to feel that you're all part of a team, but in the end, you want to get their trust, so that when you say, I want that sort of practical light, or no, I don't want any backlight in that visual effects shot because it doesn't match what I did in the last shot. You know what I mean? It doesn't match mine and the director's view of the world we're trying to create. It's always been about trust and about relationships. But I do feel that there's less, I don't know, maybe there's less personality in films now. It's more like a process and a business, and it feels like a lot of films are just made out of a machine.
Well, I think it's also because the budgets have gone up and up and up. So there's more and more of a financial risk. So suddenly they're trying to make sure they put certain formulas in that they think will work.
Yeah, and unless you're Chris Nolan or Sam or somebody, you're not going to have that kind of freedom.
Bev, we've talked about a lot of the things that maybe young or new cinematographers or maybe lacking. What advice would you have for somebody who's coming up, whether it be to learn the color science or learn something else, to really make sure they are able to be the best they can in terms of color and working with post and stuff?
Well, I think take advantage of your relationship with the facility, your digital facility. In the old days at the laboratory, a DP would shoot a test and they'd come in and look at it with the the color timer. And we'd have DPs who would say, can I have this room for a couple of hours? I just want to sit here and study these prints. I mean, I think young cinematographers need the ability to do that at their digital facilities. Shoot a test, shoot a wedge test, shoot something, go in with your colorist, get there with your digital dailies person, look at it on the scope, learn all that you can in the facility that's going to be doing your DI so that you look at your work in a different way. You look at it in the way that you need to look at it for I would bet you a paycheck that any facility that's working with you would figure out a way to make that happen, because it's going to make it easier when they deal with your projects. It's going to make it easier for everybody. And I think too many people, whether they're young or old, have sort of fallen into this trap of, I can be anywhere and I can call my colorist. I don't even have to go there anymore. But I think you really need to learn. It's a way to learn the technology in the way that you need to understand it, about what you do on the camera and what it looks like on the other side, and how much you can play with it before the noise comes out. You can do all those kinds of things in a session for a couple hours, a couple times a week, that I'm sure any facility would be willing to work with you on that. And I think it's what I would do. I mean, if I didn't know digital, I'd go in and play. I used to do that at eFilm. I'd go in with the colorist and let me see you play with this, because I don't understand digital as relation in the same way that I understand film. And I think if you do that enough, then I think your confidence is more in what you're doing and how you're doing it. And I think that's key when you look at somebody like Roger, when he can look at it at the campfire and look at his lights and know what he did and know the image that he's going to get on the back end. That's experience. And that's what you want to do, is build over a period of time that you know exactly where you are when you're exposing, so that you don't have this feeling of not being sure. Sure, you could fix some stuff in post, but you shouldn't want to fix the whole thing in post.
And also, I think that if you get a job, an opportunity to work on something, test, because you're then testing specific things that you're actually going to be using. Test it, try it out different ways, see whether, if I light it this way, it's actually going to give me more noise or whatever. So.
Yeah, I mean, like the question I was talking about earlier about color, whether you do it in camera or do it in post. If you want to create the sort of orange glow of Blade Runner, go in and see if you can do it on a flat, neutral negative. And how does that look? And then, and just what's the comparison between doing it that way and doing it in the camera?
And also,
on the lights.
For the effect that you want, what's the minimalist way? Which lights to gel that give you the look that you want, but you don't have to gel all the lights. So.
Right. So I go back to, just going back to it's about relationships and having a relationship with your lab and timer when it was film, but it's the same thing now, having a relationship with your colorist and having someone back in the lab when you're on location and who's in the digital lab saying, it's okay or not. I have James, thank God. But, it's having that relationship with everybody that's involved. And I remember years ago shooting film in England before you, Bev, where I was shooting a candlelit scene. I didn't really know the timer. I knew the lab, but my regular timer wasn't doing this. It was a very expensive candlelit scene with some high-name actors. And I wrote on the sheets, warm candlelight. And so I'm sitting in the projection room at Pinewood the next day, and all you could see on the dailies was the flame of the candle.
Forget the people.
No people. It had been printed for the flame. So there were colors in the flame of the candle. And I'm sitting there with, the director and all the actors, and I nearly fell through the floor because this was almost the first scene. It was Bob Rafelson and it was Mountains of the Moon. And I had the camera sheet there and I looked at it and it was printing at 50, 50, 50. And I turned to Bob, I said, we got to turn this off. This is nonsense. This is not the negative. Don't worry about it. And he's sitting there watching it, and they don't turn it off. He said, no, I'm not worried. It'll be fine. I trust you. And I thought that was amazing. I don't think he did. I think he was absolutely scared that it was nonsense. But the reprint looked lovely. Actually, I couldn't have been more happy with the scene. But that was the miscommunication because I didn't know that particular timer. It was a timer that come on my regular guy's day off or something like that. And he'd just gone, oh, candlelight, print for candlelight. Lesson learned, right? Lesson learned.
Wow.
You guys have talked a lot about printer lights and the actual process. I know, Bev, you went through it, but can you explain that a little more? What does 50-50-50 mean, or what are the printer lights and how that actually affects what you're seeing on the screen when it comes out?
Oh boy. A printer has calibrated lights that go from 1 to 50. RGB. In the old days, there were also cyan, magenta, yellow, but that was a different type of printer. But the modern day printers were RGB, and red, green, and blue. Red creates cyan dye, blue creates yellow dye, and green creates magenta dye. And that combination will give you any color that you can imagine, variations on how much light you're actually getting. Those dials are on a printer, and there's a light source that is separated for each of those colors. So when you put a negative up on a printer, there's a negative, there's a light source, and on the back of the light source, there would be print film. And there was, in the old days, there was actually a printer tape that was punched in order to tell the printer how much light and what color of that light to expose through that negative to create the resulting print. In the 2000s, we came up with the technology that we could actually do that with a computer to create those looks. But in the old days, you would see people with a printer tape. They would load it into the printer, and that would tell the printer how much light at each scene change, because there were notches on the negative that told the printer when a scene was happening. So basically what you did is you ran that negative through this light source, and depending on the assigned lights that had been given to it by the dailies timer, you exposed a certain amount of light onto that print. And then you would take that print and run it through the developing machine, which is very much like a negative machine. Basic, same number of steps. But I know it's amazing when you think about it that things looked as good as it did when you figure how rudimentary and primitive it seems to talk about film and exposure. But that's basically what you had, is you had a negative that you put light through, and you told that light what color, how much value you wanted of all of those colors, and it would create the light on the print, and that print would create a dye when you put it through the process, and you would end up with your print of your dailies or your motion picture film or whatever. I mean, it's really, even when I was there, sometimes I would walk through and look at a development machine, and I would see the print come off at the end. And I'm like, this is still a miracle when you think about it. It lasted almost 100 years. So yeah, it worked, but it was still very, to me, it was always amazing. It looked as good as it did when you think about all the sprockets and solutions and light sources and things that film went through to create an image. But that's basic. Did that make sense to you, Matt, what I said?
Yeah, it's truly extraordinary hearing the process. The fact that all this care went into it to create something, and it was the perfect storm of everything had to go right. Now people have a memory card, you light it, you hit record. Yeah, there's other things going on. You bring it into a computer and you play with it, and then file export, and here you go. Here's something that you can look at. And it just doesn't feel as sacred anymore, or like it's not that special care that goes into it. So.
Yeah.
I remember when I was working in the lab, that was after the time, because they used to notch the negative, which is scary because that's making it a little bit weaker. But then they got into that technology where the tape could also tell them when to make those lighting changes. So you didn't have to notch the negative. And that was really big news, which was great.
But to look a bit clearer about printer lights and color, so you had RGB, and I think it was 7 points to a stop, right?
Six,
so it's
six and
about
a half
seven
to 7,
points
yes.
to a stop. Six and a half, 7. So if your negative was a stop over, instead of printing at 27, or what some people printed at 25, I printed 27 average, 28. But if you knew, okay, that's where you want to be is 27 or 28, then if you were at 34, you knew your negative had twice the amount of light that the normal negative would have, right? It's got another 7 points, which is another stop, which is double the light, and so forth. And then you could look at the 3 color numbers, and you could tell which color was spiking and which wasn't. And I remember sitting with Mike Millikan on a light box with a print or with a negative once, and adding little gels to look at it to say, well, maybe if we go 2 points here.
It was generally the corrected print. You would be looking at the
we were
print
looking at
and
the first,
with gels. Yeah.
The first answer print, looking to see where we would go next print. And sometimes you would print 5 or 6 times to get the final arrangement of density and color. So we'd be looking at these frames and putting little gels on to figure out how far we wanted to go. I mean, it was extraordinary, like Bev says, how you end up sometimes getting the result we did.
And another thing is when you're in the answer print stage where you have A and B negatives and you're working with the negative, you're counting in your head how many corrected prints you're making because you're running that negative through the machine again, and you're hoping to get to the point where you can at least make an intermediate and be working with that. So there was that pressure, let's not do 25 corrected prints.
And then on top of that, you see, for me, the biggest change for me between digital and film has not been necessarily all the process, it's projection. Because the biggest problem was when you saw an answer print and you added a point of yellow here, a point of yellow, a bit of density there, and then you saw the next print, it might be a new bath the next week. Now, I know most labs had pretty accurate baths, but sometimes they were always slightly different. They could be slightly different.
When you were correcting that minutely.
And when you were looking at something so minute, you didn't know that shift, And then when it started getting to making a release prints, I mean, I remember James going to Canada to oversee a release printing of a film we'd worked on.
Jarhead,
Yeah, Jarhead, to make sure that the release print was in the right way, that it's not only the temperature of the developer, but it's the intensity, a Monday bath, a Friday bath. There was a kind of joke about a Friday bath, because it wasn't necessarily as strong as a Monday bath. I don't know how much is true or not about that. I heard there's one particular lab in New York, didn't have a lot of space, so they actually ran the printer faster with a hotter bath. And then another lab I used to use, Duart, which didn't do that. Duart was known for the best quality processing in the Northeast because they had the best bath and the best quality control. So there was a whole lot of things for that.
Well, they ran a 3-minute development time on the print, which was what it was designed by Kodak. And I have to tell you, there were years that they tried to pressure me to go to a true hot process at Deluxe, and I wouldn't do it. Technicolor did a hot process. The reason they went to the hot process, which was a 2-minute, 20-second development time, was so that they could get out release prints faster. That's why that a guy by the name of John Baptista, who ended up dying of a heart attack at 52 because he spent his whole life working on the hot process to create this viable way to do release prints, and you would be able to do them a lot quicker. And at Deluxe, a lot of people kept saying to me, we need to go to a full hot process because we'll have people doing dailies at Tech, and then they come over here for a release print, and our contrast is not as high as Technicolor because one of the things that you did with the hot process is you got a higher contrast. And I'm like, guys, we're not going to a hot process. I'm sorry. We got a lot of cinematographers who like where we are. And we're not going to go to a hot process. I'll stay where I am. It's a little hot, but it's not as hot as it was there. So you're exactly right. I tell you something else we never talked about was in the days, probably in the 2000s, late 1990s, early 2000s, Fuji was getting a lot of play. They actually got contracts. New Line became a contractual print process with Fuji, which prior to that, it was all Kodak. You might have a couple small films that would do Fuji. But that was what gave me a lot of gray hairs, is that if we were running a movie and there was also a Fuji movie going through and it was a huge release, we had to monitor the process very closely because there were byproducts coming out of the Fuji film that would affect the overall curve shape of the processing of everybody's prints. And you would say, wait a minute, guys, we because you couldn't get to a point, because, I probably had 25,000 gallons of developer separated through the various machines. And the good thing about having a huge development tank is that if there were slight differences in chemistry, you tended not to see the effect of them when you had such large volume, which is why we kept a big process. But if in fact it was a huge Fuji release and most of the chemistry had Fuji in it, if I was running a reel of your answer print, I was looking at it, making sure it didn't adjust in the so sometimes in the room, I'm sure Mike probably didn't even realize what was happening. He would say it's slightly different if he compared the two reels, slightly different than it was before. We'll get it back. But that was the kinds of things that became very difficult to control.
Yeah, exactly.
Was that overall curve shape, and you would come in on a Wednesday and come back on Friday. A lot could happen in those 2 days.
Yeah, and the other thing about the development is not just the hot bath. It's not only the contrast and the saturation seemed to go up, but also the grain. I mean, I could always see. I went to this one lab to have part of a film done at that lab, and I pulled it out because I kept saying it's grainy and contrasty. I don't understand why it is. And I pulled it out of the lab because nobody ever told me. But then I heard from other DPs, cinematographers, that what it was, they were hot bathing the negative. So it was all these crazy little things. But to go back to my original thing about the biggest difference for me between film and digital now is you don't have those processes. I'm pretty assured now that somebody in the theater in Wilmington is going to watch the film as it's meant to look as somebody down here in Santa Monica. And you could never be assured with that with film. I'm sorry, with the best lab and best everything in the world, you could never be assured of that. Never happened. The show prints were always great, but the release prints sometimes they would match reels on a release print. When a print got old, they would say, "Oh, we'll take reel 5 from this other print." Yeah. And then put it in, but that was skewed magenta, which you didn't notice when it was in one batch. When it was all even, skewed, yeah. But when you put it in another...
But you noticed it at the changeover cues, didn't you?
Exactly. As soon as the reel changed, bang, suddenly it would all go green. I mean, it happened all the time. And because the business model didn't allow for...
Well, everything for the lab actually went to hell in a handbasket when we came up with 10,000 release prints worldwide, and then all the multiple formats as far as sound was concerned. Because, the labs didn't get a penny extra, but they had to make sure that all the sound versions now had to be on that print and had to be QC'd and had to be right. And the studios never gave us any extra money to do that. We had to come up with the technology to make that right. So it was really difficult trying to hold the standards as tight as we did. But as you said, because you knew what happened. You'd finish reel 4 of the reels, and then you'd have to wait for 2 reels for visual effects. You didn't get them until 4 weeks later, and then you're trying to do the rest of them. It was a nightmare.
Yeah.
This stuff is so far over my head, and probably a lot of people that are learning out in the digital world. I mean, one of these Kodak or somebody, if they want people still shooting film in whatever years, they should have a free course. Come to us for a week and learn how to do all this.
Yeah, no, you're right there. How's somebody just going to go and shoot film without knowing this stuff? I don't know how you can.
Yeah, tell them to lose my phone number.
Well, thank you, Bev, for walking down memory lane with us, and we learned a lot, I hope.
Well, I tell you, it was a great time. It was a great time. I had a great career. I was very fortunate to have landed where I did and was able to go work at eFilm, and I left happy.
Thanks for listening. If you want more information and further discussion, check out the forums at www.rogerdeakins.com. Becoming a member is free, and you can ask follow-up questions there. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more new questions and topics. See you next time.